The study of scriptures is a challenge. Now, there are technical skills that one can master. I'm not, in that sense, a person who teaches at a university or seminary level. But when that is said and done, there are no question about the technical abilities. But you also have to allow the scriptures to be read within the life of the church. How does it apply to the church at this time and place? Then there's the fact that the scriptures must read our culture and be read into our culture, and our culture seen through the lens of scripture. But the real difficult part in all of this is that ultimately that scriptures must speak to what I am, and conversely, what I'm not. And so the journey through scriptures, like a gospel like Matthew, is tough because it constantly brings you back to how you are not measuring them, where you need to make changes, where you need to grow, mature, and to develop. And so the scriptures is a fascinating study as one begins to explore the nature of what it means to be Christian in the place that God has placed you. I will be looking at Matthew chapter 21 and verses 45 and 46. I'm only looking at a more recent modern translation. It's the New Century Version. Let's see if we can get that on the screen. There you go. The Everyday Bible. Matthew chapter 21. And the last two verses of this chapter. Verse 45, when the leading priests and the Pharisees heard these stories, they knew Jesus was talking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they were afraid of the people because the people believed that Jesus was a prophet. Notice what Jesus has done. He's taken scripture from out there, taken it, the technical side of it, the scripture in the church, the scripture in the community, brought it to bear on the religious leaders. Ooh, not good, Jesus, not good. And these two verses, we have a digest of the events of the week. It is probably not too wild of a speculation to say that the religious establishment had their spies/informants who gathered information. We do not need to think that the religious leaders went around listening to what Jesus said. I kind of tend to discount that because that to go around and listen to what he was saying would be to, well, call attention to it and point the people to Jesus? No, probably not. It is quite possible, given the entrance that Jesus made into Jerusalem, that there were some rather wild speculations floating about what Jesus would do. What we have is a case in which Jesus was doing his things and the religious leaders in Jerusalem off to the side, taking stock of what was happening while plotting out their next move. The space in which Jesus had to work in while in Jerusalem was due to the position that the religious leaders were in. Understand, they were not free to just do what they wanted to do. The religious leaders were religious, and in that sense had to work in light of the image that they wanted to convey and carry in the society that they were a part of. The religious leaders had authority downloaded to them from the Romans. They could not just do what they wanted to do. You see, they were not free to simply murder Jesus. You see, they had to uphold an image before the crowd that was consistent with their religious heritage. Understand, when you look at the crucifixion, the reason why the Romans had to kill Jesus was ultimately because the religious leaders wanted to look like, not us, we're too nice and too good to do that type of thing. This is why Jesus had to be condemned by religious leaders, though on religious grounds. That was the start, and that's where things moved from. But they knew that if they were to sell the crowds on the murder of Jesus, they had to get the crowds to see that Jesus was anti-religionist. The problem for the religious leaders was to find a pretext for arresting Jesus on some sort of blasphemy. If you look at the growth in of the church in the Roman Empire before the Edict of Milan, 313 CE. The Edict of Milan is simply a legal decree by the Roman government that allowed for the toleration of religions, various religions in the Roman Empire. The net effect was it was to allow the church to move from being illegal to legal and allow the early church to take over as a dominant social institution in the Roman Empire. Now, as we look back at the pre-Edict of Milan period of the church in the Roman Empire, note that while there were times of persecution, we tend to think of like Nero or Decius or Diocletian, and under their reigns, it got pretty brutal. But understand that while there was persecution more so at the local level, that there was not consistent and complete and total persecution of the Christian church all through this era, even though the church was not a legally recognized institution. And it was not simply because the state apparatus tried to ignore the church and pretend it would just go away. In simple terms, the state had more pressing issues. They had wars to fight, taxes to raise, and public infrastructure to build. You see, we're not throwing up here a theory as much as just an observation. The state, that is the Roman state, simply did not have the will or means to eradicate the church. Yes, the church was illegal, but through this period, the church often had enough space to work and do what it needed to do. The work of the church need not fear its enemies outside the church. They are always there. Jesus found space in a hostile environment in Jerusalem in that final week, in Galilee, to preach and to teach. The early church in a hostile environment found the means to grow and develop. In the midst of that, they carved out a niche and grew and developed and took hold in the Roman world. The church today needs to take care of its business and not worry what the world out there thinks. We have the means within to succeed at what God has called us to do. The world and its ways do not represent a threat to us. This does not mean we will be immune from times of affliction and persecution. They may come, but as Jesus said, reading from the New International Version, Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it.